Hey everyone, this is Beardo here to present you with another issue of Graphic Issues with my partner in crime, who is.
Agent42q to you internet people.
so Today we are going to tackle a big subject, the subject of death in comics. Ever since books like the death of Superman, sort of the purpose of death has been kind of repurposed. Traditionally you think about death as an end, but in comics, especially since stuff like Death of Superman, it's really been repurposed as sort of a way to sort of reboot books or to change characters or basically as a catalyst to bring on something new. Obviously, from people sort of outside the comic world, this sort of seems to kind of cheapen death. When you have a lot of characters who are rooted in, like death in their past, like Batman or someone like that whose parents died that made him who he is, you kind of get kind of a mixed message there. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about is the way Death of Comics and treated good? Is it bad? Is it cheap? What is it? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Agent42q.
Yeah, so I guess the big thing would be to start to break down kind of just everything you said in that intro there.
Yeah.
So, back when, I mean, a lot of your death in comics was, at least superhero wise, more your origin stories or characters that are impetus, like victims of crime, but your actual cast was mostly safe from death because without them you can't keep telling your stories, obviously, or you'd have to rebrand it or what have you. But you would have those moments. You'd have your Robins dying, and your like Captain Gwen Stacy's die. Um, well, though interestingly to me, how did the whole first Robin death to Nightwing thing start? I guess.
So, how did Dick Grayson become Nightwing? Is that your question?
Well, didn't he die?
No, just
No, he just
just
quit.
Jason Todd died. What happened with Dick Grayson? And this is kind of actually kind of interesting because it's a difference between the way characters evolved back when and the way they evolve now. So you think about someone like Dick Grayson, who basically, if you go with the original history, basically just grew up. He went to college and eventually he just sort of felt the need to get this new persona. It was just kind of a natural transition for him. On the flip side, you have someone like Jason Todd, who, granted, when he was killed, wasn't necessarily intended to bring back, but just for the sake of argument, he has to die to become someone like the Red Hood. He doesn't, people don't really transform that way naturally in comics as much anymore. It was just sort of they killed him off, and then when he comes back, he's this whole new thing. You know what I'm kind of getting at there?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I guess I was confused because I remember reading the Judas contract, and that's when he decides, like, I can't be Robin anymore, and I have to have my own
Yeah.
identity. And he took it from that old Superman character, which I don't know anything about.
Yeah, I didn't know that until recently, actually. I was reading that on Wikipedia randomly.
I thought that was like a post crisis deal, though, and they did something before it. My bad. I don't know that, but you definitely have your characters who died. And I guess that's a good point. Like there used to be more natural endings and beginnings. There'd be more of an evolution of life, and characters would grow and grow up. And it seems like there's something so much grander because now Nightwing is, in a way, almost his own mini brand. I mean, of
Yeah.
course, associated to Batman and all that, but he's his own thing, and he's been all over the place. And now you don't get as much of that, and that's partially because these characters don't get the opportunities to grow as they once did, I guess, in certain ways. So,
Yeah, for sure.
and then I guess that's a lot of DC, but I mean, like on Marvel's side, when I was talking about it, like the Stacy's dying, they were definitely side characters. And when Captain Stacy died, it was a big moment for the comic and a
Right.
big tragic deal. But when Gwen Stacy died, it was almost revolutionary for comics. That kind of, in a way, cracked open the door for more permanent characters to be off and kind of have that. I mean, and at that time, and certainly some other times after that, there's definitive shock value to that, and
Hmm.
in a way that, I mean, that's still talked about in a way that is somewhat shocking and was a big deal and still is because of the impact that that had. Of course, there's a few other things going on with that to make it so impactful. Whereas when they kill a character now, like what comes to mind is Professor Xavier, because I think he was the last big deal to get offed.
Yeah, probably.
It has no impact because a lot of people were still going, oh, wait, Professor X is alive again after the last time they killed him, which was only a few years ago.
Yeah. And that's where
And
you get into the whole thing where death just becomes a catalyst to do something different or to change things up a little bit and then go back to normal later.
And if you know behind the scenes, Marvel has a mandate that's been running for a few years now where they're going to kill a major character every year. And so far, it seems like X-Men have got the ass handed to them from that.
Well, Thor was last year though, wasn't he? Wasn't it Thor? Was with Fear itself?
Was he ever. Did that count? He
Oh,
was dead for like a month? I don't know.
I have no idea. But but I mean that would have counted as they're like meeting their mandate. I assumed that was there someone else that they killed that year?
Probably.
Well, true.
Well, I just remember the first one being sad was Nightcrawler.
Yeah.
They killed off. And when they killed off Nightcrawler, something was just lost. He's a character that I know a lot of female readers gravitate to, and also, I mean, obviously, the interesting thing with his looks and the fact that he's such a devout Christian, and
Yeah.
having that element in the books was interesting.
Yeah, it
And,
created another layer of reading under
right.
between the lines. Yeah.
And to just take him out just for, I mean, his death wasn't shocking except in the fact that when you read it, you're like, oh, wait, he's actually dead and he's gone and they've been holding on to it. Now they have this dick Nightcrawler in there and I don't care. I mean,
Yeah.
he's from the AOA, Age of Apocalypse universe,
Okay.
and he was brought in through Uncanny X-Force, but it, I mean, the whole point is that he's not Nightcrawler, he's just Nightcrawler from another universe, so he basically just looks the same as another personality. But I don't know. It's just it just when they start doing stuff like that, and in a way, a kind of a snuff film sort of feel, it just
Yeah.
feels cheap.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting too because like back when like say Jason Todd died, obviously that had a little bit more fire under it because the fans demanded it, quote unquote. But there's this element, of the general public saying like um who are these like bloodthirsty comic book fans that what I mean? Like it had a lot more of a like social impact that comics were killing these characters, kind of like you talked about with some of the Marvel ones, except that this was definitely more of a an accusation of being bloodthirsty kind of a thing. Um, but of course, like I don't feel like that was necessarily true at the time. Although nowadays, when you have someone like Marvel, who's just basically mandate like, well, we're going to kill someone every year. Like, what does that really say about where the industry is at, and in terms of like where we're at in reading comics? So, I guess for you, like, what kind of impact does it have for you, like generally, if they kill someone off? Like, are you really affected by it at all now? Do you think it has impact? Do you think it's sort of gone, or where do you think death is at in comics right now
I,
for you?
I, as far as just simply being a reader, I can't think of the last time there was a character that died that impacted me in any other way than, well, crap, do I want to keep reading this book because they're dead?
Yeah,
Like one of the characters I like.
yeah,
Or, oh, they killed some character I don't care about. They'll be back within the year or so, probably.
yeah,
Oh, well. Like,
yeah.
it doesn't. I can't remember the last time it was used in a story effectively.
Uh
I don't
huh.
know. How about you?
It's interesting because I honestly can't remember the last time. Like now that we're here, I feel like I should have done a little more thought on this before we started. But like, I really can't think of anyone that in recent years that's really had any kind of an impact. Um, I mean, if you think about part of it is the turnaround on these things is so much faster. So like you look at like Crisis on Infinite Earths, and they killed um, Barry Allen, the Flash, and he didn't come back until 2010 or whenever. I think he came back in Final Crisis when he officially was back.
Yeah, that
You've
was
got
great.
yeah, but my point is, you've got what 30 some years or 25 years of Barry Allen ostensibly gone, dead, presumed dead, whatever. Whereas the flip side of that, you look at something like Infinite Crisis, where Superboy died in 2006, and he had his own series and had come back to life. I don't even know how he came back to life, but he came back to life, got his own series by 2010. So,
Well,
like,
his alternate self from another reality punched reality, causing a ripple that allowed him to crawl. I don't
is
know.
that really what happened, or are you just
Oh,
like,
I have no idea. I'm just pulling this from my.
yeah, something like that?
No, that's how Red Hood came back, right?
I don't even know. Honestly, as a huge Batman fan, I'm not even entirely clear on how he came
That's
back.
what I
Or at least today.
recall. Yeah.
What's that?
I recall it was something with Superboy Prime punching reality, allowing him to pop out of the grave, and then he ran for a while, and then Roz or his daughter found him and threw him in the pit.
I
And
think I think that he's had a couple of honestly, I think he's had a couple of different reincarnation, like different versions of that from other. Because I think when he
yeah,
first came back, it was really technically a tie into Infinite Crisis, and it was probably the reason you explained was because like Superboy Prime was like doing stuff to reality or something. But then after that, like once Infinite Crisis is kind of settled down, I feel like they came up with like a more I don't want to say more reasonable because I don't think there is a reasonable way to bring Jason Todd back, but like like a more tried and true, like more Batman way, like with a Lazarus Pit or something like that.
right. Well, and I think us talking about it now kind of gets the underlying point or the underlying feeling that I think most seasoned comic fans have
Hmm.
is that we're pretty numb to the idea of death for our characters at this point.
Yeah.
It doesn't like I remember the last time they killed Spider-Man, which was I think the first like official death of Spider-Man. And it wasn't even like there was a turnaround or a world without Spider-Man or like some people didn't even have to like reconcile the fact that Spider-Man was dead. Like
Hmm.
he was just back in
Yeah.
the next issue. Or I think maybe there was an issue. I don't even remember. It was so terrible and I want to forget it. But
Yeah.
the whole impetus of killing him was so that they could rebirth him so that he'd have new powers so that they could try to spice it up for sales. And then it all became pointless because then they gave him a new suit which had new powers, some of which effectively redoubled some of the powers he had just gained. And then, like a year or two later, they just rebooted the whole thing and he was back to having web shooters anyways. So,
Yeah. Well, since we're talking about death and we're talking about like you mentioned, like there was no world without Spider-Man. So like we should talk a little bit about sort of the both the famous and infamous one, that really seems to be the milestone between sort of death then and death now. There's obviously a fairly famous YouTube video called "Death and Life of Superman" by people who are basically kind of
the
like
director of Chronicle.
yes, and telling basically the story of the death and life of Superman, but also kind of being a little bit sarcastic, having a little bit of commentary thrown in there as well. Um, and so let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about death and life of Superman because, I mean, I can't think of anything that really was. Well, first of all, you can kind of justify killing Superman during that time period. Like, I mean, in terms of like not necessarily the reasons the writers had for initially doing it, but the idea of like, well, let's see if people really care if we kill him, kind of a thing. And like, let's make it, having the whole world without Superman kind of has a, like, let's show people what it would really be like without Superman. Like, out of all of the stuff they did with that, I think World Without Superman was probably the strongest of the three parts of that story. Um,
Yeah, without question.
yeah, which isn't much of a contest, but I mean, like there's something interesting thematically and sort of culturally to kind of mine with that. So they kind of turned, something that might have been a pretty sour, typical death event into something that is kind of a little bit special, at least for that reason. And of course, that just sort of turned into the paradigm of how they do it now. But, so would you say Death and Life of Superman? Would you say like that story is at fault for giving us this glut of sort of death in comics, or would you say that it's operating on a different level in some way?
Well,
Which is, I know, a complicated question.
well, I mean, on one hand, I mean, when they were going into that, and I don't want to talk about the editorial side of it yet, but
Yeah.
it's artistically ish.
Yeah.
When they were approaching it, they knew they had to treat it with a certain amount of respect. They were doing something that was a big deal, and I think they really got some wind of kind of how big of a deal it was, because despite the fact that, comic sales were, I think they were still, there, but kind of dwindling, Superman was a national icon. And so when they were killing him in the comics, that made, not just like, well, I don't think there was as much comic news. I mean, there was Wizard and whatnot, but it made national news. Like,
Right.
It was actually something talked about, and it was kind of a big deal. And people are like, well, what are they like? It's kind of confusing to them too, because they're like, well, I guess they're done making those comics, like, because they figure,
Well, and they did
right,
keep publishing them for 3 months too. Remember?
right, and then they went in, they started publishing the book again, but it was without him. But so they kind of played that line for a while,
Yeah.
and then you have the pretenders to the throne show up, but for a while there, I mean, it kind of raised a question of, like, at a certain point, like, do you allow the myth to end, if you will? Like, if you look at kind of with the Greek mythology allegory, like, at a certain point, when do we stop telling these stories for this time? And the answer is, as long as they sell, never. But so I don't know. That's kind of where I'm at on that point. I don't know if you have more to throw in on that.
Well, do we want to talk a little bit about sort of the editorial machinations behind that story?
Yeah. So
The real story behind why they killed Superman, or like, there's so many different layers of like, why they killed Superman when they first decided to do it, as opposed to later on down the road, of course. But starting at the beginning.
well, as much as I know, is that there was a show at the time
Yeah,
called
Lois and Clark
Lois and Clark, right? And that was the Superman on TV, which
romance.
was actually Superman, none of this Smallville emo crap, which is probably a better show. I don't know.
They were. I think they both are equally like cheesy in their own way. I'm sure.
Oh, well, fair enough. But the big thing that they were going to in that show was getting the two characters married, which made a lot more sense for the show because it was so much more about the romance between those two than the super heroics with rubber suit monsters or whatever they were doing in their bizarre Lex Luthor.
Yeah.
But the comics were developing to that point too, and they said, well, we can't actually have the comics do it first because it's going to steal all the punch fit from the show. And so the comic people, you're going to have to wait a year before those two can get hitched. And they're like, great, well, we need to keep Superman busy for a freaking year before we can marry him, put an end to this non-question romance, which I've heard arguments as to why they shouldn't have gotten married. I'm like, yeah, but weren't they dating for like 2 decades without... I don't know.
Yeah.
It just seemed bizarre to me. Like, of course they were going to get married. But they need to do something with Superman instead of just Monster of the Month for a year with Superman, which would be pointless because it's Superman. They decided to give him a dirt nap, which I guess ended up lasting, way more than...
Yeah, it turned into a lot bigger thing. Well, from what my understanding is, because I've heard Mike Carlin basically has literally come out and said at one point or another, Um, basically, it's like they're sitting around the editor's office and they're trying to figure out what to do. And it's like, well, screw it, let's just kill him because, like, literally they had no other ideas. And apparently they had talked about killing him like every year when they had no ideas. And this was the year that it's like, okay, we're really gonna do it. And then, of course, they did it, and it kind of backfired in the sense that they weren't expecting it to be as big of a deal as it was. Um, and then, of course, once it went way beyond their expectations on that front, that's when it turned into basically what, probably 3 years worth of continuity, between all of the different stuff that happened. I would assume probably must have been, maybe it was 2 years. I don't know. Either way, a lot longer than what they had needed it to fill. Um, so yeah.
Right. So, yeah, and then I don't know, you have a lot of the interesting stuff, and I really think the reason why The World Without Superman really was kind of the part worth reading of all that is you get to see all these characters deal with the idea of the invincible ideal, that most of them aspire to, or, I mean, in one way or another, derivative of in a lot of ways. Like there's a lot of interesting metaphor there too, and there's a lot of interesting sequences with Batman, with him dealing with the crook in Metropolis and him scaring the crap out of him. He's like,
Yeah.
"You can't do this here." Batman's like, "Fine," for him today, and just leaves the crook hanging there, Spider-Man style. But I don't know, it was just a lot of interesting interplay, and also at that time, I can't help but feeling that DC is trying to introduce a glut of new blood.
Hmm.
And I think they're in some ways trying to make room for it because they've struggled with this for years. I mean, they have their holy trinity and now kind of their holy foursome.
Now with Green Lantern.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they want more characters to be recognized, but they have trouble,
Packaging them.
yeah, like making it work.
Yeah.
And I feel like slowly John Constantine's actually creeping up there faster than some of the rest. And then Booster Gold, I think they've pushed hard enough that he's finally a bit more of his own thing. And
Yeah, a bit.
yeah, and then I guess Flash is kind of there too. But all right, we're back. Sorry, my internet cut out for a second. But basically, to wrap up that whole Death of Superman thing, wherever I was on that,
We died and we were reborn, and now this is the new us.
like the Phoenix, the Phoenix 2.
Phoenix
Yeah,
is-
I guess the main point of the YouTube video that we keep going to, and we should post a link if no one's seen that for whatever reason. The point that he makes in there, which is kind of interesting, is the idea that the death of Superman didn't kill Superman. It killed death in comics. Kind of robbed it of its gravity, because suddenly anyone could be killed and come back for whatever reason. And we'll talk more about the coming back next time, as our next topic shall be that of rebirth. But we kind of wanted to move to more actual deaths in comics.
All right.
I already stated about Spider-Man and how that was pretty freaking
It's
lame.
non-existent.
We already talked about Red Hood. But I mean, there's a lot of other notable ones, like the Phoenix, or Jean Grey, during the Dark Phoenix Saga. The reason that they actually killed her when they did was because they kind of made an editorial thing. They were trying to play up this whole idea of the Dark Phoenix and how, how powerful and how terrible it was and how it was having an effect on her. But then she went and she, like, destroyed entire planets, then, like, an entire solar system, and just was, like, mass genocide. They're like, oh, wait, that's completely irredeemable, isn't it? I guess she's gonna have to die now.
Yeah.
So they kind of actually just screwed that up, and that's
Yeah.
why they killed her.
So here's a question: like, why So even that, so like here's a question of like, is that really an effective, like, is that the most effective way they could have concluded that story, would you say? Like, do you think there would have been more there if she had been alive? Because I mean, obviously it's like the moral thing is, well, she has to die because she's so horrible or whatever. But at the same time, like, I feel like that would be a lot of interesting fruit for for story ideas for a lot more conflict later on in the story.
I Well, it kind of ended up being so anyways, because the X-Men were intrinsically tied to this because they defended Jean, they fought for her right, so they were always kind of guilty of defending the Phoenix.
Right.
Which, if they played that the right way during this whole AVX thing, it would have had more point to it instead of a whatever the hell they did.
Whatever they did. I don't know.
Uh,
I didn't read it. I'm proud to say I did not read it.
yeah, good choice. But I don't know. It's kind of hard to say because Chris Claremont wrote the X-Men forever,
Yeah.
and there's only really two stories that people really talk about, and that's the Dark Phoenix and Days of Future Past. And he wrote X-Men for a long time, introduced or really developed a lot of characters, even if he wasn't the exact first person to bring them to the comics.
Uh-huh.
And that's kind of those are the big things. And I mean, don't get me wrong, the Dark Phoenix Saga probably would have been, decent comics if Jean Grey hadn't died, but because she did, it is probably the most famous X-Men story of all time.
Yeah.
So I don't know, where do you put that then? It's just
Well, I guess that's because I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's interesting that I mean, it is because she died. It is sort of the biggest X-Men story that's out there. But at the same time, like I still personally feel like you could have gone in more interesting directions ultimately by keeping someone that volatile alive. I don't mean in terms of powers, but I mean in terms of like the moral difficulty of having to deal with this person who is so um, far gone or whatever. I don't know. I just feel like it's even that is which is such a tried and true example of like this great death in comics. To some degree, I feel like is even a little bit even that death is sort of the easy way out in a lot of ways. You know what I mean?
well, yeah, but at a certain point, you have these people risking their lives every time, and if some of them don't get offed every now and again,
Oh, for sure. I'm not saying that, but it's kind of like with with Nightcrawler. Like he's an interesting character to keep alive because he adds something extra. Like you don't have to kill Jean Grey in order to be in order to prove the situation is serious, kind of a thing. Like you could choose a different character if that was the case.
yeah, no, and I think, like I said, I mean, part of the problem is they accidentally wrote themselves into a corner. It wasn't actually the original intent. They just kind of mess. I mean, and there's other things too. I mean, this isn't exactly a death issue, but to speak to kind of that, where sometimes the response is more of what determines the editor or determines kind of the next step than really what the writers intended was during Craven's last hunt with Spider-Man. Spoilers. Craven commits suicide at the end because he figures he's done. He bested Spider-Man, but he doesn't actually kill Spider-Man because they didn't want to deal with that then, which made a lot of sense. But they found an interesting way they buried him alive, which in a lot of ways is more horrifying.
Right.
Interestingly more horrifying, anyways. But Craven commits suicide. And there was this outcry of mothers basically saying, you can't have people committing suicide in comics. It offers this idea that it's way out, whatever. And some, I'm sure, somewhat justified legitimate arguments, some mothers crying out. But they did this reaction story called The Soul of the Hunter where they showed Craven in hell because he committed suicide. And they made this big deal about it. And it's actually a pretty bad comic, but it was just done to quell this outcry, and so you have this kind of weird taint to the story where not only do you see Craven's kind of unultimate fate because they brought him back, but they never really addressed that comic when they brought him back, probably with good reason. And also, it, interestingly to Death, it shows very definitively that there's a very Christian value assigned to someone who was very definitively not a Christian character.
Yeah.
And so you have this interesting stance of morality, whether it's just kind of an editorial overarching thing or not. But what's interesting is when you see death in comics, it's very rare that it's handled in a way where it's, I don't want to say culturally sensitive, but I mean culturally diverse even. It's pretty much pretty standardly a very...
Heaven, hell, that's it.
Yeah, not even just Christian, but almost Catholic angled view of death, I'd say.
That's interesting.
So, yeah. I'm trying to think. One character I wanted to bring up just to kind of talk a little outside the realm to give some perspective. The Shredder is an interesting look at death within comics because with the original chunk, the first comic they kill him and it turns out he didn't die. But that was pretty forgivable because, I mean, you understood the original Ninja Turtle comic was supposed to be this one shot and then they were done, and so that was their climax. And then when everything happened, they brought that character back with good reason, and then when they killed him again, he was dead.
Yeah.
And they made a big deal about it, and there were still ramifications, and the character's legacy lived on until the volume ended, but which in a lot of ways made it a lot more interesting, because you got to see a lot more of how big of an impact that character had within that universe, even post-mortem, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know if you could think of any characters like that where in some ways they almost were more impactful dead than
After
alive.
they died. Yeah, that's a tricky one. I haven't really thought about that. But I mean that's and see that's an example of, for me, like a death that really is effective because, the death is the story. You know what I mean? And that's kind of where, again, like with like going back to the Phoenix Saga, I don't know why I'm suddenly picking on this so much because it's a great story and all, but it keeps coming up now. But you know, the death of the Phoenix isn't so much the story as the Phoenix itself is the story. So once you kill her, the story just kind of ends. Whereas with the Shredder, that's just part of a bigger story, and you have the people going beyond them, and that's where the death is really effective in comics. And the fact that I can't really think of anything kind of says a lot about how little death is effective in comics, I guess, because there's not a lot of examples like that, really.
Right. And I wanted to kind of
Other,
touch a couple
sorry.
other Marvel characters too.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, other than like the characters who are dead as part of the premise of the character, in the first place.
Oh, yeah, that's kind of where I was going to go
Oh, okay, go for
with
it.
one of them next, which was not many people read it, but there was the Spider-Man offshoot called Slingers, and in it there's this character called Dusk. And when you open number one, of which there were four variants with slightly different pages, is a really weird thing they tried to do to sell it. But
Okay.
all of them, you open up page one, and there's a crime scene with this girl who tried to make a jump, and she died. It's not like she jumped from a building to commit suicide. She was trying to like parkour it and missed. Uh, and so you start off with this goth chick dead.
Hmm.
And then as you go throughout the comic, you get a little backstory on her and the rest of your characters, and it turns out her being dead and being tied to all this mystic energy is actually what makes her a superhero. And there were some gentle leanings, but the comic never really got to explore it, but there was kind of a master hand over all these characters and a mystical tie to all of it. And I think they were starting to get at the idea that the older gentleman in charge would kind of like was pushing her into dangerous situations, knowing that her death would unlock her potential, and this never really happened. But it was interesting because that character started out dead, and
Hmm.
then move from there. And that was kind of interesting because you had this goth chick dead and moving on. So
Yeah,
yeah, and I think that leads us to our actual avatars of death, if you will.
yeah. Which we kind of started to touch on almost when we were talking about religion and sort of the religious implications of death, seeing as, as you said, things seem to be very Catholic in comic world. Um, but I guess there are a lot of different versions of death across, even just DC and Marvel. Um, Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, no, no.
Well, I was just gonna bring up Agent42q was just looking online and saw death has personified death is in fact not one but seven different characters in the Marvel universe alone, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, that's one of those ones where it almost makes sense. And in Marvel, I mean, the one that you see most commonly in Marvel is very much the Grim Reaper looking sort of death. But death is a female in that understanding, and you have a lot of interesting interplay with Thanos and death. And then also for a while, you had interplay with Thanos and Deadpool and death, where Deadpool, who would heal himself, would keep actually dying, and like he was actually in love with her, and so she was kind of into him because he's kind of the bad boy. And then Thanos eventually actually cursed Deadpool with eternal life so that you keep away from his girl,
Yeah.
and you have that whole angle, which I just love. I just love that. But I mean, you had this character who's constantly dying, but he had a very justified reason as to why he come back.
Uh
Yeah, but they were actually playing to the idea that he had a death wish because he wanted to bang death, basically.
huh. Yeah.
And then, of course, the whole Thanos thing where he's trying to court death, and that was a bit more serious and part of the whole Infinity whatnot Marvel is doing for a while.
Yeah.
And I guess interestingly to that too, I mean, the most known death avatar in DC is a female as well, but she's played more like a cutesy goth chick, obviously, with the Endless and the whole Sandman lore.
Yeah.
And played even more cutesy when Jill Thompson did the two manga versions of that death. But with that character, you get to actually really explore a lot of different death, and there's actually very specifically a lot of exploration of the cultural ideas of how death is handled, contrary to what I was saying before. But
Yeah. Yeah. True.
right. And so, uh, as far as death in comics, I mean, it's just such an interesting idea that you do have a lot of usually these, at least Christian overtones,
Hmm.
and yet you do have a walking embodiment of death that most of these characters have actually encountered at one point or another and then still lived.
Yeah. Yeah, so like on the DC side, like you have someone like the Spectre who is very. See, I wouldn't necessarily. He's very like Old Testament in my opinion, because he is very much sort of the hand of God. He's not death, but he is. He does sort of bring people to their fate to a degree and exact vengeance. I don't think it's. If you didn't know this, it wouldn't surprise you that the Spectre is created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, and it's not surprising that this is going to maybe sound bad. I don't mean it to sound bad, but the fact that that character came, um, from a Jewish perspective rather than like a Christian perspective is kind of interesting in and of itself. Um, and then you also have a lot of one thing, especially in DC. I feel like, although I may just not be thinking of Marvel examples, but like you were talking before about the characters who are um, have this tendency to sort of court death or be around death. Like you do have a lot of those in DC as well. With uh, recently Resurrection Man, um,
Oh yeah,
where you've got this guy who his soul is more valuable than other souls because the devil is trying to get the soul and he keeps not being able to get it. because this guy keeps getting resurrected over and over again. You have like Kid Eternity, who's a little bit more complicated. I don't know enough about his because he's been sort of reinterpreted multiple times. But there's sort of an element of him um, being able to tap into the dead, sort of. I don't want to say too much about that because, again, I'm not 100% sure. But again, these do, like we were sort of talking about before, they do have roots in sort of very religious undertones. Another example of that being the Phantom Stranger, most recently, where I don't know if you've read the most recent couple of Phantom Strangers, but he is Judas.
Right.
Stranger
I heard about that with the
and the 30 pieces of silver
silver. Right.
is his necklace, which I find really interesting, but it's at the same time it's really surprising that, especially with DC, who claims to be sort of trying to bring more diversity to their books and all this stuff, that they're taking these old characters and giving them very Christian backgrounds. Kind of interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Well, what I find interesting too is, I mean, you have, and that's more of a religious route, but I mean, you have Superman, who was this Jewish creation
Hmm.
in so many ways.
Oh yeah, I've
And
always thought Superman is a Jew. I
right.
try and convince people of that because nobody believes me, but it's true. He's very Jewish.
Well, he was, but by the time you get to the death, and I mean, we'll talk more about this with the rebirth, but I mean, it was handled in a very Christian light, and when you actually see him dead
Yeah.
in heaven on the farm with Pa Kent, in this white light, and it's just filled with very Christian references. It's just so bizarre.
That's so interesting. Like, it'd be interesting to do. This is like a whole other topic, so we can't go into it, but like, the idea of the death and life of Superman is the point where, because there's really definitely at that point, you get sort of this Jesus element injected into the Superman mythos that has since, become, in my opinion, way overblown and way overplayed, especially when you get to something like Superman Returns, Bryan Singer's movie, where it's all very Christian and very, very Jesus and that kind of thing. And it's interesting that this character who was created by Jews is this very Jewish kind of embodiment in this character. Um, when he actually dies and is resurrected, at that point he becomes Christian. That's very interesting to me for some reason.
Well, in some ways, I think there were some Christian overtones with the character, kind of more. What is it? The Man of Tomorrow, like when they relaunched it post Crisis, I think. Because I mean, for a while, I mean, whatever religion, like there was nothing there for a while. I mean, it was just
Right.
kind of the character was there, and post the original creation, he kind of certainly deviated,
Yeah.
and it's just so interesting that he's so religious, and then you have your counterpoint always of, well, your two counterpoints majorly with Superman, which are Shazam, which plays into the whole, oh God, is it Greek or Roman? It's
Um,
Roman, isn't it?
I don't know which. Sorry, I can't help you.
I feel dumb now, but yeah,
I
one
know
of
what you're
those
talking
two.
about, though. Yeah.
Which, I mean, interestingly ties back to Wonder Woman in a weird way with him. But I mean, you have that whole idea of not religion, but something that's understood as legend, then tied to that. And then with Batman, in a lot of ways, it's very interesting that Batman isn't a more religious character, right?
Yeah.
So there's just that whole deal, and then you have the whole, I mean, Christian overtones with Deadman and the Spectre and whatnot that you were talking about there with the DC, and Marvel just doesn't have anything really like that, because when they go more mystic, it tends to be more occult than religious.
Yeah. Which is interesting too, because like DC has this huge, magic section of their universe, whereas Marvel, if anything, has shied away from that the further and further into the 2000s we get, especially. There's really not much.
Well, the thing with Marvel and their whole mystic side, when they were playing more on that side of the street and playing with, I remember there's another death embodiment that was there in some really crappy Ghost Rider comic I read once. But when they were playing that side of the street, it was all tied to their '90s grit sort of deal, and so it was all supposed to be rad, dude, and kind of like chick biker, I don't know, gothic crap. That I think all kind of washed away when the hip thing went from goth to emo. So
Yeah.
that just kind of all vanished overnight,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, straying away from death. But the interesting thing, besides the religious end, is you obviously have your other end, where both companies have their way of handling zombies and vampires, and that whole angle.
Yeah. And with DC, it's not even really ever since Blackest Night anyway. It's not even really zombies anymore. It's all integrated into the Green Lantern's universe now. Really, I mean, you don't get
Right.
zombies traditionally anymore in DC. You got basically, effectively, you got Marvel zombies in continuity with Blackest Night, and that's kind of the direction they've gone now.
Right, and well, it's kind of interesting because Marvel, whereas the Marvel zombies have crossed over very definitively into the Ultimate Universe via the Fantastic Four,
Yeah.
and lightly through Deadpool maxi series, um, they're kind of understood to be otherworldly, which tends to be thought of more as a DC idea. The idea of multiple realities, but it's certainly there in Marvel.
Yeah.
But in DC now, how it translates to the 52, I have no freaking idea. But essentially, the Black Lanterns is the superhero zombie equivalent, except they're more and less terrifying at the same time. I don't
Yeah.
know. What was it they had to do to kill them? Just use the white light or
I
detach the
don't
ring?
remember. It got all jargony. It turned into just some. It turned into a Skittle Fest, and I stopped paying attention.
Well, I read all of that. And it seemed like every spin-off had a different way of dispatching them one way or another. But what was particularly bizarre about Death, and getting back to kind of the whole becoming numb to death,
Mm-hmm.
was I remember by the time the Batman 3-issue Blackest Night arc was ending,
Yeah.
they announced the Doctor Who-esque travel through time with Batman, a la
Yeah.
Mr. Crazy Man. And so, they killed Batman,
Mm-hmm.
Bruce Wayne Batman, the Batman.
Yeah.
That'd actually be interesting if it was the Batman was Bruce Wayne, just Batman was some. Anyways, uh, um, when they killed Bruce Wayne, people were upset and this and that, but people are kind of interested to see where Dick was going to be. But we all knew
Mm-hmm.
Bruce was going to be back.
Yeah.
And when Batman died, it didn't leave a lot of reaction. But it was just before that they killed Captain America, and the Captain America death had about as much reaction as the Superman death did back in the day,
Yeah.
which was interesting and made me really glad that I got that issue because that's worth some sort of actual money.
Yeah.
But then when they brought Captain America back after Bucky, who was one of those characters who should have stayed dead and actually won awards for staying dead the longest before they brought him back. uh, right after they did that, Batman was back.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, the parallel and the timing was bizarre because it looked like they killed Batman purely as a response to the Captain America death. And you had that whole Marvel versus DC sort of thing going on. I don't know if you were feeling that at the time.
That's interesting. I can see where you're getting that, except that with Grant Morrison, having read all those Batmans when they were coming out, I think that was part of the plan all along.
There's a plan to that coked out trip? I don't buy it.
It's such a convoluted plan. I mean, we won't even get into that because that's a whole other video. But But I do think that that was actually premeditated long. Like, when did Captain America die? Like 2007? Something.
Somewhere around there. I don't have the exact date in my head. It was right around. Well, it was right at the end of Civil War for no good story reason, really.
Yeah, so I mean that's around the time that Grant Morrison was coming on to Batman. So I mean you could say that it may have been a response, I don't know. But maybe this is a good way to kind of tie everything together because kind of going back into that era. So we started with um, characters who die and are sort of intended to stay dead, and that's death has some real impact in those circumstances. And then somewhere in the 80s and the 90s, you get this shift where it's all about with the Superman thing and all that, where death becomes a way to kind of revamp a character and bring in a rebirth or a revamp, whatever. Now, when you get to up to now the level of like Blackest Night, you literally are using death to basically revamp your entire line, your entire company line. At the end of Blackest Night, really that whole story was a vehicle to bring back 6 or 8 characters all at once and sort of set out everybody in their new directions with Brightest Day. Which is kind of interesting that now, I mean, it's not just a matter of like, well, we'll kill a character to get them, to bring them back in a couple months or whatever, but now it's literally an entire event that encompasses, the death, the bringing back, and the relaunch of, in some cases, the entire, line of a company, like with DC and Blackest Night to a degree, which is kind of, interesting that it's gotten to this level, and you kind of wonder, what's next? Is it going to get bigger? Is it going to get less? With these companies, starting everything back at issue 1 or whatever they're doing, I wonder if they're going to make an effort to bring back death to something a little bit more potent for us as readers, or if it's just going to kind of continue on the trend that it is and just become more and more meaningless, if that's possible.
Yeah. To wrap in some of the things I wanted to get to too. I mean, there was a time when deaths, and it kind of interchanged a bit, but I mean, like, you had the death of Captain Marvel, which was they were killing off a character they weren't doing much with, and they made a big story. That was something that resonated and was talked about post its moment, and it was used to actually say something about cancer, and it was impactful. Very similarly, Colossus was killed for a parable of that with the legacy virus, but when he killed himself, that meant something. And so, with his death being tied to something so momentous, that death meant something when it happened. And I want to talk more about that when we talk Rebirth. But then you move to the other end of the spectrum, where you have events like Ultimatum that Marvel did, which was effectively a snuff film, except in comic form, where basically anytime they kill a character now, it's not something that just happens in the story. It's on the cover, it's in the previews, someone will die, but who? And you usually have some sort of layout of the cast and maybe a few red herrings. Yeah. And then someone dies. Or, I mean, even though I'm liking it so far, the Batman event right now, a death of the family, it's right in the title. And so it's not something that they're just going to let happen. They're going to try to squeeze that thing for sales. And I think that's kind of the crux here is, whereas artistically it feels kind of cheap at this point, there's not a lot of point to it, and we bitch and complain about it, as a mass, as comic fans, when there's a death issue, it sells better.
Yeah.
And it could be because we're fascinated by it, or maybe you're just curious, you want to be up. There's a million reasons why that could be, but until people stop, buying extra issues just because someone's going to die, it's not going to change, which is interesting, because pretty much everyone bitches about it, but then pretty much everyone buys the issues at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like In a lot of ways, it's kind of the tabloid issue of comics in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
Just appealing to your basest interests.
Yeah.
Like,
So, random thought. I thought of remember you were talking about the Shredder and a character whose death, it's really about the death becomes the story and it builds out of that.
yeah.
I couldn't think of a character. I just thought of one.
Okay.
Karen Page.
Who?
Karen Page.
Karen Page. Oh, with the Daredevil. Really?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the repercussions of that from what 1999 is still felt today in the issues coming out, literally this last month.
Is it? Oh, do people care?
About the death of Karen Page? Well, I
By the
mean,
time Kevin Smith got through, she was a coked out whore. I didn't think anyone cared.
well, it's one of those. That was the idea at the beginning. Was they didn't think anyone would care, and then they did. But I mean, think about how like that event became the catalyst of everything that happened to Daredevil in Brian Michael Bendis's run. Really, it all kind of stems out of that one event and how that affected him. And even now, like with him having all these delusions and thinking he's seeing his wife and not, and all this stuff, like that all really comes out of that one moment with the good death of Karen Page in Daredevil. So that would be
Yeah.
if you want to end on a note of a good death, in my opinion, or a smart death, or whatever, a well-written death.
Well written. Well written.
Well written. A good death. But
A good death would be the Joker. That's the other aspect of death that boggles my mind when it comes to superheroes. Is I get a lot of supervillains, either they can't be put down or not, but when you have Joker going in and out of Arkham Asylum, killing people, and I know they addressed this at one point, but...
Oh, they've addressed it 1,000 times, and they find terrible ways of getting around what you're about to say, but yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's just... And the one that gets me, too, that they haven't addressed it with is Carnage in Marvel. I mean...
Yeah.
Why not put him down? There's no reason not to.
See, in my opinion, we're drifting now again, but that's in my opinion, that's bad writing, because if you have a question like that, you just don't you don't make the story about that. Like, there are stories where it's literally like, do I kill Joker? Do I not kill Joker? And like the fact that you're acknowledging that question kind of defeats the purpose, because there's really only one right answer to that.
But there's some framing, right? Like, I've never seen this comic story where, Paragon Hero A, whichever one, not your Punch or whatever, obviously, or even more like your Wolverine or whatever, captures, for whatever reason, this notorious bad guy who's done things for, X time, gotten to the point where it's, their MO. And then he turns them in, and then the Justice Society says they might be insane, they might be wrong, but letting this person live is civically irresponsible.
Mm-hmm.
And then they kill them, lethal injection style or what have you, and then the public feels safe, and then the hero, thinks about the rest of their villains. It seems like that would be a story point to deal with at one point or another, because they dance around this mortality thing, and if they did it to one of the characters for certain reasons, talk about why they don't, I don't know, it seems like there's a story there, because it's something that they dance around, they don't address, and so that's usually when it gets to a point where an editor would say, well, whoever, do you have the balls to tackle this subject? Because there's a story there. We've been dancing around it forever, but there's a story there.
So maybe that's something that, like, if you want to have it, and this is really interesting actually that you bring this up, because I do actually have an example of that. But that's maybe that's where the next really good death story is not in where one of our heroes dies, but where one of our heroes kills someone and dealing with that for the next several years. And the example that I have of that, and this it was initially well realized, but then it kind of went off the deep end because it tied into Infinite Crisis. But when Wonder Woman killed Maxwell Lord, I don't know if you remember that, but Maxwell
I do.
had possessed Superman, and there's that great page. I think it was in an issue of Wonder Woman, where she snaps his neck, and it's
Oh
literally
yeah, it's
like a
the
panels.
oh DC
And
got
yeah,
mileage out of that panel. Yeah.
they did get mileage, but I mean, that's at least making an attempt at dealing with that issue a little bit. Like again, that wasn't the focus of it, so that didn't really go down the direction you talked about. But the catalyst of it's there, and if I'm thinking of deaths that really like strike me or were really memorable of the last 10 years, I would say Maxwell Lord is actually really up there.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, that was a huge morality moment. I
yeah,
remember,
that was enormous when that happened.
and I remember people arguing like, "Are superheroes kill?" Or at least the characters in there are like, "Do our superheroes kill now?" and all that. But I mean, she said it. I mean, it was all there. It's like, well, what else do you do at that point?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. It was just it was interesting, but at the same time, I almost feel like the stakes were so high that the morality issue was kind of downplayed because there like was no other way out.
Yeah.
And I don't know, but I mean, I think that's a step you have to take, but definitely
Yeah.
it's there.
So
And I think we're going to see something interesting to that end of that morality with Punisher Warzone coming up, but we'll see how that plays out.
yeah, we'll see. Well, hopefully, I mean, I think that again, I think you're right that they in with Infant, since that really was just a tie-in. I mean, that the whole death of Maxwell Lord was a tie-in to the OMAC project, which was a tie-in to the lead-in to Infinite Crisis. So, like, that's even though that was a huge moment, that's literally like buried in tie-ins within tie-ins within tie-ins. So, there's no way you can really give that kind of a story the justice it really needed and deserved. So, I mean, I say like, I think that is definitely the next great story is really dealing with that issue, and who knows, maybe they'll do it, maybe they won't, probably not for a while, but we can hope.
Maybe it'll be Valiant and no one will read it, so it won't be a problem.
Yeah. All right. So, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that covers that. I mean, we've danced around it so much now, so I think really the only next things to talk about is the whole rebirth issue, which is what we want to save for next time.
Yeah. So we'll be back sometime in the near future with um, Rebirth and superheroes. This is Death, and I am Minutia Minute, and my friend is.
Agent42q.
All right. Thanks everybody for watching. All two of you.
All right. Peace.